For centuries, some of the most important chapters of human history survived only as fragments. A line in an old manuscript, a shape buried beneath a field, a broken object in a museum drawer, or a rumor passed down by people who no longer understood where it came from. Then archaeology found the missing pieces. In recent years, discoveries across Britain and Europe have revealed worlds that were far more connected, organized, symbolic, and violent than older history books often suggested. A 5,000-year-old decorated chalk drum found above the remains of 3 children has revealed artistic connections stretching across Britain, Ireland, and Orkney. Excavations connected to modern construction projects have exposed early Anglo-Saxon graves filled with weapons and jewelry, offering physical evidence from a period often described as a historical dark age. In Roman Yorkshire, a strange bronze hoard containing an imperial portrait, a figure of Mars, a measuring tool, and a broken key has opened a mystery about religion, magic, work, and ritual. And at Waterloo, archaeologists uncovered human and horse remains that expose the brutal human cost behind one of Europe's most famous battles. These are not stories about one lost empire. They are stories about ordinary people whose lives became visible again because something survived beneath the ground. Together, the finds reveal a simple truth. History is still incomplete, and the missing pieces are often waiting where nobody thought to look. The first discovery takes us to East Yorkshire, near the village of Burton Agnes. Archaeologists were excavating a large circular ditch known as a barrow. They expected to find a burial in the center, but they had no idea how unusual it would be. What appeared were the remains of 3 children placed together in a carefully prepared grave. Small stones had been positioned beneath their heads, creating the impression that the bodies had been given individual attention. Then, above the children, archaeologists uncovered something that immediately changed the importance of the site. An elaborately decorated chalk drum preserved in astonishing condition despite spending around 5,000 years underground. At first glance, the object is small and surprisingly modest compared with the monuments associated with prehistoric Britain, but its surface is covered with intricate decoration. One side features geometric shapes, including lozenges and triangular forms. Other surfaces carry flowing, circular, and figure-8 motifs. At the top is a cross-like symbol that archaeologists interpret as a possible early solar design. The craftsmanship is extraordinary because there is no obvious reason to expect such detailed artistic work from a period so distant from writing and metalworking. Yet the drum is real, carefully excavated, scientifically dated, and connected directly to a burial context. That makes it more valuable than a beautiful, isolated object. It tells archaeologists not only what people could make, but what kinds of things mattered enough to place beside the dead. The drum also helped solve an older archaeological mystery. 3 similar objects, known as the Folkestone drums, had been discovered in the 19th century. Their unusual decoration had already made them famous, but without modern scientific dating, archaeologists had estimated their age largely from style. They were believed to be around 4,500 years old. The Burton Agnes discovery changed that interpretation. Because the new drum was recovered from a secure archaeological context, scientists could apply radiocarbon dating to the associated burial. The result placed it at roughly 5,000 years ago. That means the related Folkestone drums are older than previously thought as well. An object that seemed like an isolated artistic curiosity became part of a much earlier tradition. The decoration is perhaps even more important than the date. Similar visual motifs appear in different parts of prehistoric Britain and Ireland. A particular figure-8 or butterfly-like pattern on the Burton Agnes drum has parallels with material discovered far to the north at the Neolithic site of Ness of Brodgar in Orkney. That does not mean the same artist made the objects, and archaeology cannot simply assume that similar patterns had identical meanings. But the similarities suggest that communities separated by hundreds of miles were participating in some kind of shared artistic conversation. They may have exchanged ideas, objects, people, or stories. 5,000 years ago, Britain and Ireland were not isolated worlds. The sea connected them. The burial of the children makes the discovery even more moving. Archaeologists do not have many comparable burials from exactly this period, and that scarcity makes every unusual grave especially informative. These children were placed together carefully, their heads supported, and the decorated drum positioned above them. There was clearly an intentional ritual involved, but the exact meaning is unknown. The drum could have symbolized ancestry, protection, the sun, the afterlife, or something whose meaning has been completely lost. Some of the related drums contain designs that look vaguely like faces, leading researchers to wonder whether such imagery could represent protective beings or companions for the dead. There is no final answer. What the evidence does establish is that the burial involved effort, craftsmanship, and emotional significance. The timing places the children and their drum within the same broad period when Stonehenge was taking shape. Around 5,000 years ago, communities in southern Britain were beginning to construct monumental landscapes, and the earliest phases of Stonehenge were already associated with burials and the cremated remains of people. The Burton Agnes drum was not part of Stonehenge, but it belonged to the wider cultural world that produced the monument. People were transforming landscapes, commemorating ancestors, tracking the seasons, creating symbolic art, and defining places as meaningful. Stonehenge, therefore, should not be imagined as an isolated invention that suddenly appeared in an otherwise ordinary farming world. It emerged from a much larger cultural network already experimenting with ritual and monumentality. Other discoveries around Stonehenge reinforce that interpretation. Causewayed enclosures, such as Robin Hood's Ball, predate the famous stone monument and suggest that organized gatherings were already taking place in the landscape. Archaeologists have found pottery, flint tools, antler implements, and other objects, showing that people traveled to important places and brought distinctive local traditions with them. That means Stonehenge was probably part of a landscape that developed over centuries, rather than a single project completed according to one master plan. Different generations contributed ideas, built new features, changed older ones, and perhaps transformed the site's meaning over time. Even the stones themselves now tell a broader story. The giant sarsen stones were transported from a relatively local source in southern England, while many of the smaller bluestones originated in Wales. But the altar stone presents a completely different picture. Geological analysis indicates that it is not Welsh. Its composition points toward northeastern Scotland, hundreds of miles away. A stone of that size could not have arrived at Stonehenge by accident. Someone, at some point, decided it needed to be there. Moving such a stone without modern machinery would have required enormous amounts of labor and organization. It also suggests that Stonehenge was not merely a local construction project. Communities from far beyond southern England may have contributed materials or participated in an interconnected ceremonial tradition. This discovery changes the meaning of the monument. Stonehenge may have functioned as a place where communities came together, especially during moments of social change. Britain in the 3rd millennium BCE was not a unified kingdom. It was a patchwork of communities with different traditions. Yet people were moving materials across enormous distances. That movement itself would have required social connections. A stone from Scotland placed in a monument in southern England could have represented more than engineering. It could have represented alliances, ancestry, shared identity, or a deliberate statement that distant communities belong to the same world. The archaeology around Stonehenge also reveals something else. These monuments were not built by ghosts. People had to live somewhere. Along major modern construction routes, archaeologists have uncovered earlier settlements, including evidence of houses associated with the prehistoric communities living in this landscape. Experimental reconstructions, based on archaeological remains, have shown that small prehistoric houses could be constructed from timber, hazel, chalk, clay, and thatch. People created insulated interiors, stored heat using stones warmed in hearths, and built spaces suited to life in a wet and unpredictable climate. These discoveries remind us that monumental architecture existed alongside ordinary domestic life. The people who moved giant stones also cooked meals, repaired tools, slept under roofs, raised children, and struggled with exactly the same basic problems of shelter and weather that human communities face today. Another set of discoveries comes from a much later period, when Roman rule in Britain had ended and the island was entering a completely different political world. Along the route of the HS2 railway, archaeologists surveyed areas before construction. What initially appeared to be an ordinary landscape gradually revealed an extensive cemetery containing early Anglo-Saxon burials, dating to the 5th and 6th centuries AD. This period has often been called a Dark Age because written sources are scarce, but archaeology tells a richer story. The graves contained spearheads, shield bosses, knives, brooches, and other objects associated with early Anglo-Saxon communities. These were not just collections of weapons. Their presence inside graves provided information about personal identity, status, gender, and social roles. Some individuals were buried with more elaborate objects than others. Some graves included children. The cemetery, therefore, represents a functioning community, not simply a collection of warriors. One burial was especially disturbing. An iron object was found embedded in the lower spine of the skeleton. Archaeologists could not immediately determine whether the injury caused the person's death, but the evidence shows that violence happened directly to the individual. Unlike a written account that might simply describe a battle or conflict, this injury records violence physically in bone. It is a moment preserved without words. That kind of evidence is powerful because it bypasses interpretation and takes us directly to the body of a real person. These graves also complicate the old idea that Britain simply collapsed when Rome withdrew. The 5th and 6th centuries were undoubtedly unstable, but they were not an empty period. People continued to farm, trade, create jewelry, organize communities, bury their dead, and participate in systems of power. Material culture reveals changing identities and connections across Britain and continental Europe. The graves therefore help replace a vague idea of decline with something more realistic, transformation. A different kind of archaeology can be found at the battlefield of Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo in 1815 is remembered as Napoleon's final defeat, but physical evidence from the battlefield has been surprisingly difficult to recover. A project known as Waterloo Uncovered began systematic archaeological work and discovered objects and remains that connect directly to the events of the battle. At the farm of Mont-Saint-Jean, which served as a field hospital, archaeologists uncovered human remains. Human skeletons from Waterloo are exceptionally rare despite the enormous number of people who died there. Historical accounts describe mass graves and other forms of disposal, while later stories suggest that bones may have been removed from the battlefield and reused for fertilizer. The evidence for that entire process remains incomplete, but it helps explain why so few bodies remain today. The discovery of human remains at the field hospital therefore creates an unusually direct link to the wounded and dying. The bones show injuries, including severe damage to limbs. In a place where surgeons would have carried out amputations using basic 19th century methods, the remains provide a physical reminder of what military medicine meant before modern anesthesia, antibiotics, and trauma care. Waterloo is usually discussed through commanders, formations, cavalry charges, and strategic decisions. Archaeology reveals the people who experienced those decisions from the ground. Then the archaeologists uncovered horse skeletons. Several animals had been placed in a specially prepared pit, and the arrangement suggested that the horses may have been killed after being badly wounded. This detail is important because cavalry warfare depended heavily on horses. Yet discussions of military history often treat animals as background. At Waterloo, thousands of horses were present, and many were killed or injured. The horse remains at Mont-Saint-Jean transform a statistic into a physical scene. The animals were part of the battle, and their deaths were part of its human cost. The archaeology becomes even more powerful when personal artifacts can be tied to real individuals. Among finds from military landscapes are objects such as dog tags, uniform pieces, buttons, and ammunition. In one case, a World War II dog tag recovered by archaeologists was linked to an American paratrooper through its name and service information. Research into the soldier's history allowed the object to reconnect the battlefield with his descendants. A small piece of metal became evidence of a specific life. That is one of archaeology's most compelling abilities, turning anonymous objects into personal stories. Another recent discovery comes from Roman Yorkshire, where metal detectorists uncovered the Rydale Hoard. It contains 4 remarkable bronze objects, including a bust believed to represent Emperor Marcus Aurelius, a detailed figure of the god Mars riding a horse, an unusually large plumb bob, and a decorative broken key. The objects date from the late 2nd century AD, when Roman York was developing from a military center into a prosperous urban and administrative hub connected to wider imperial networks. The portrait of Marcus Aurelius is especially impressive. His hairstyle and forked beard match known depictions of the emperor, whose reign lasted from AD 161 to 180. Yet the workmanship appears provincial rather than metropolitan Roman. The person who made the object may never have seen the emperor. Instead, they likely worked from representations circulating through coins and sculpture. The object shows how imperial imagery traveled far beyond Rome itself. The Mars figure tells a different story. Mars was the Roman god of war, and his popularity in Britain is unsurprising given the military importance of the province. The detailed horse, harness, helmet, and clothing show the skill of the craftsperson who created it. Originally, the god would have carried a shield and spear. The image presents Mars as an active protector associated with warfare and military power. Then comes the object that makes the entire hoard difficult to explain, the plumb bob. Unlike the statues, it is a practical measuring tool. Plumb bobs could establish straight lines, and several could be used as part of surveying equipment. The inclusion of a technical object alongside religious images raises an obvious question. Why were they buried together? Archaeologists have several theories. The objects could have been buried by a religious official connected to the imperial cult. They could have been placed by a soldier who worshipped Mars. They might have been gathered by a metal worker intending to recycle the bronze, or the plumb bob could indicate a farmer who buried the objects as a ritual offering connected to land management and agricultural success. Roman religious practice was often woven into ordinary life, so the distinction between religious and practical objects may not have been as clear to them as it is to us. The broken key adds another mystery. Was it already broken before burial? Was the damage deliberate, or did it happen naturally underground? Researchers cannot yet say, but broken objects sometimes appear in ritual contexts, and Roman Britain has produced evidence of complex relationships between everyday objects and magical practice. A key could be practical, symbolic, or both. Taken together, the Rydale objects show why context is so important. A bronze bust by itself is interesting. A bronze bust buried alongside a military god, a construction tool, and a broken key creates a historical puzzle. Archaeology becomes less about identifying objects and more about reconstructing the intentions behind their combination. This is the common thread linking all these discoveries. The Burton Agnes drum matters because of the children beneath it. The Anglo-Saxon weapons matter because they were buried with people. The Waterloo horse bones matter because they are inside a battlefield hospital landscape. The Rydale hoard matters because its objects were deliberately gathered together. Context transforms an artifact from something interesting into evidence. Modern technology has helped make these connections possible. Radiocarbon dating can transform assumptions about age. Geological analysis can identify where stones came from. Geophysical surveys can reveal graves before excavation. DNA can identify relationships between ancient individuals and modern populations. Microscopic analysis can reveal traces of trauma. Every technique adds another layer to the story, but technology alone is not enough. The most important discoveries still depend on careful excavation, recording, interpretation, and a willingness to admit uncertainty. That uncertainty is essential. Archaeologists still do not know exactly what the Burton Agnes drum meant. They cannot prove who commissioned Stonehenge or why the altar stone was transported such a long distance. They cannot say whether the injury found in the Anglo-Saxon cemetery caused death. They cannot identify the exact person who buried the Rydale hoard. At Waterloo, the identity and complete story of the human remains are still being reconstructed. But the inability to answer every question does not make the discoveries less important. It makes them honest. Archaeology is not a machine that produces perfect answers. It is a process of building better explanations from incomplete evidence. And perhaps that is why these discoveries matter so much. They restore complexity to people who disappeared from the written record. The 3 children buried beneath the decorated drum were not merely Neolithic people. They were children whose community invested care in their final resting place. The person with the embedded iron object was not simply an Anglo-Saxon warrior. They were a human being who survived long enough to become part of a community and perhaps experienced a violent event that remained visible in their skeleton. The people at Waterloo were not simply casualties in a famous battle. They were soldiers, patients, and animals whose remains preserve the brutal physical reality behind the historical narrative. The person who buried the Rydale hoard was not simply a Roman. They were an individual making a decision whose meaning we are still trying to understand almost 2,000 years later. This is what archaeology gives us that history written by rulers often cannot. It gives the dead a physical voice. It shows that ordinary people existed inside the great events. It reveals that the ancient world was not a collection of monuments. It was a collection of lives. That is why the greatest archaeological finds are not necessarily the largest. Sometimes the most important artifact is small enough to hold in one hand. A decorated chalk drum can reveal long-distance cultural connections. A stone can reveal movement across Britain. A spearhead can reveal social identity. A bone can reveal violence. A bronze figure can reveal religious practice. A broken key can reveal ritual behavior. A dog tag can reveal the name of a person who would otherwise be forgotten. The objects are small, the stories are enormous, and every discovery changes the picture. History is not finished because archaeology is not finished. There are still fields that have never been excavated. There are museum collections containing objects whose meanings have never been fully understood. There are battlefields beneath modern farmland. There are graves beneath roads and buildings. There are ancient landscapes hidden under forests or buried beneath centuries of soil, and somewhere among them are more missing pieces. The discoveries of recent years remind us that the past is not a distant, sealed world. It is physically present around us. It is beneath the ground. It is in the objects we walk past. It is in the bones that survive after names disappear. It is in the landscapes whose original meanings have been forgotten. The Burton Agnes drum survived because it was buried with 3 children. The Stonehenge story survives because stones, burials, and landscapes endured. The Anglo-Saxon story survived because people buried weapons and jewelry with their dead. The Waterloo story survived because fragments of battle remained in the soil. The Roman story survived because someone buried 4 bronze objects together. In every case, survival depended on chance. Someone chose a place. Someone buried something. Someone built something. Someone left something behind. And then time covered it. Centuries passed. Generations forgot. The landscape changed, but the evidence remained. Archaeologists simply had to find it. That is the real story behind the greatest finds of recent years. Not that history was rewritten because scientists discovered a secret civilization or a mysterious technology. History was rewritten because evidence made it possible to ask better questions. The past became more detailed, more connected, more violent, more emotional, and more human. We are still missing enormous parts of the story, but every excavation gives us another fragment. And when those fragments are finally placed together, the picture becomes clearer. Not perfect, not complete, but closer to the people who actually lived it. That may be archaeology's greatest achievement. Not bringing the past back to life, but allowing the past to speak for itself. And the most fascinating thing is that it is still speaking. There are more graves, more roads, more objects, more bones, More monuments, more forgotten names, waiting underground, waiting in museum collections, waiting beneath the landscapes we think we already understand. The greatest archaeological discoveries are therefore not just finds from the past. They are reminders that our understanding of the past is still unfinished. And somewhere, just beneath the surface, another missing piece is already waiting,